Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Carr-Petras, and I'm here today with fiber artist Lee McComas. Lee, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm really excited that you're here. It helps that you're local here in the Denver area,
right. Yeah.
but you definitely have a national profile in the quilting world, and I want to, as we tape this, you just got juried into Houston. International Quilt Festival.
Yeah.
That's pretty exciting.
It's very exciting. So this is my second year. Last year was my first, and that was pretty thrilling because I brought home a couple of awards. So, I can only hope to do that well.
Right, that's a big deal. So,
yeah.
Well, your work is gorgeous, and I'm so happy to see your pieces here in person, up close and personal. And you've also written a book, which we have here in front of us, that shares your techniques.
Yeah, so I think what I've become known for is thread painting portraits and doing people. And I wrote a book about a year ago, last summer. I was working on it.
So that was in 2014?
Yeah, 2014. It came out just before Houston, too. So that was exciting to be able to go to the festival and go to market with a book that I actually wrote and published. And but it's been a long journey. This is thread painting, it's portraits, it's trying to recreate with fabric and thread what a paint artist would be doing with pigments on canvas. And the journey started way back when I was a teenager, very traditional quilting. So
and you grew up with that in your family? You were taught by a family member?
Yeah. So I learned to sew garments, I think when I was 6.
Okay.
So in my teens, I learned to quilt. My first quilt was hand-stitched, hand-quilted, hand-pieced, and I don't think I ever did that again. That was a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of work.
And you grew up in where again?
Missouri, just outside of Kansas City. Lee Summit is my hometown. So yeah, so I grew up with the Kansas City Star and the quilt blocks that came out in the newspaper every week, and we used to cut those out and save them.
Yep. And so let's move forward then a little bit.
Okay.
So you went to college and became a young adult, and were you still sewing through all those years?
I did. I stitched through that, and it was very much a hobby, a pastime. I still was really passionate about fabrics, but didn't really take it seriously. So my vocation is as a teacher, and I was teaching school. I did my first original quilt design a few years after I got started teaching. So it was in the 80s. It was for the first Great American Quilt Festival in honor of the Statue of Liberty and that 100-year anniversary. And so my quilt was chosen for the state of Missouri.
And what techniques did you use to make it?
That was turned applique, and it included a picture of the Statue of Liberty in the center, and then there were some borders that went on around it, and the statue was laid over an outline of the United States, but it had a field of blue with stars and some red and white stripes. So that all went together. It was my first original design, and then there I was. I got a trip to New York City.
It's exciting.
It was a big deal for a small-town girl.
Sure, absolutely. But turned edge hand applique?
Right.
Okay.
And then I added some detail by just taking some embroidery thread and stitching, chain stitching some lines and things to try and add to it. And I embroidered the stars. So it was...
and was that kind of the launching pad then from then on? You were just doing original design?
I think it could have been, and it wasn't. I turned away from that. I went back to traditional quilting, and it was just making bed quilts, making baby quilts for friends when they had babies, and quilts when they got married. And it wasn't until I think I moved back here, or back to the States. I moved overseas in the 1990s, and I taught overseas for the Department of Defense. So I lived 5 years in Incirlik, Turkey, and then I moved to Okinawa, Japan.
Wow.
And when I moved back here to Colorado, I began to meet a lot of art quilters. And that's when it really took hold.
Okay.
And at the same time, my husband was going to art school. And I was very intrigued. He was painting portraits and doing a lot of figurative work. And he kept saying, oh, you've got to learn to draw, you've got to learn to paint. But I had a room full of fabric and thread, and I was really not interested in buying more art supplies. So I made it my goal, my journey, to recreate with fabric and thread what he was doing with paint on canvas.
So you didn't actually go to art school? You didn't? Have you ever studied art, even in college?
No, but when he went to art school, I would hang out with him and his art friends. I would go to the openings. I would volunteer at the school when they were setting up exhibits and things. I learned a lot. But he paid for it.
So you paid for it too, in your own way.
Yeah,
sure, it's all part of the community chest. So.
But I was the fly on the wall,
sure.
and just picking up all kinds of information, and I learned a lot of things that I just never heard quilters talking about, and that was about using value, using temperature of color. How to bring things together, looking at where your lines are and how your proportions were in your compositions. And so that really influenced the portrait quilt work that I do.
Now, when you were overseas in Turkey and in Japan, you were on military bases?
I lived in the communities, but near them.
Okay. Yeah. Obviously, quilting is big in Japan.
Yeah.
Were you exposed to it all there? Or did you pick up anything while
I
you were
lived
there?
on the island of Okinawa. What I found was these amazing fabrics, but those people pay huge amounts of money. So I remember going to a store once, it had bolts of fabric, and I think the price worked out to about $2.50. And I thought, wow, that is a great deal, because I'm used to buying fabric by the yard. Mm-hmm. That was the price per inch. They sold it by the inch. And so, I had this stash of American fabrics, and my Okinawan lady friends who quilted were just lusted after my scraps, and they loved to take those. But I was fascinated by it because they do very small, intricate work.
Yeah.
But also very precise.
Yes,
really
indeed.
Beautiful.
And then when you were in Turkey, not really what we think of as a quilting culture, but known very much for their woven rugs and carpets, kilims.
Yeah, and halle, which are the knotted carpets, so the pile carpets.
So there's a whole, that tradition stretches back hundreds and hundreds, hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's amazing. How did that inform your aesthetic at all?
It did, or it certainly had an influence. I find that wherever I go, I tend to seek out whatever fiber art is happening there. So when I first got to Turkey, one of my first experiences was traveling with some other teachers to this small village an even smaller village up in the mountains, and girls came from even smaller villages, and they all lived in a compound together, and they would weave. They would just work at looms all day long and weave the flat woven kilims, and then the man who ran the organization would ship their work to Europe and find markets for it. Okay. But they would sit and they would work. I think I figured out the economics of it. They had to weave about 1.5 meters, square meter and a half, and that would be enough. They would donate that to the organization, and that would pay for their room and board. Anything else that they did over that, they got paid by the square meter, and that was money for them, and a lot of it sent back to their families, and most of the girls worked there until their families arranged marriages for them.
But how long does it take to weave a square meter?
How long it takes me?
No, how long did it take them?
It took me a long time. Seemed to me they worked about 1.5 weeks for their room and board for the month, and then the rest of the month.
That's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. One of the things I noticed too, some of these girls worked so long running their fingers through the threads, the warp on the looms, that they wore through their fingernails.
Oh my gosh.
And they would. That's how much they would spend, how much time they spent weaving. So it was a tough life.
Yeah.
In some ways.
And so then you found yourself in Colorado, and you've been here since
2001.
2001.
Yep.
So
back to the States.
A good amount of time now. And let's turn our attention to these quilts that we have here on the table in front of us. And talking about regionality, this guy. His name is
Zeke.
Right.
Yes.
I've seen this before. I think we've published this image before, and it's so striking. What a figure. So explain to us how you came up to this quilt.
Zeke is kind of a local favorite, and I think that's appropriate. So when I moved here to Colorado, this was like another new culture for me. And I found a photo of this guy. He lived in the town where I now live, the small town of Superior, Colorado, just outside of Boulder. And 100 years ago, it was a mining camp. Zeke was one of the miners. I saw a picture of him. He also, I discovered, ran a casino on the side. And I've seen a picture of it. It was about the size of a double-wide outhouse. So I don't know how that worked. But I just think he's so fascinating. He's got the cigarette hanging out. He's just too cool. He looks rough and tough, but he has this obvious wardrobe malfunction where his shirt's sticking out through his fly. And so that, you know, I just found him really humorous.
Right.
So this was a technique that I started to develop. It was back to the applique, but instead of turning it over, you know, now, 30 years after my first pictorial quilt, I've got these fusible webbing that I can put on the back, and so I did that. I worked from the photo, cut out pieces of fabric laying on top of each other, and then I just stitched over it. But something that was frustrating for me with this is this raw edge applique gets fuzzy, and I feel like I'm continually picking lint off of this, and there's places where the fabric frays, so that bothered me.
But even from a couple of feet away, you don't.
You know, I think we're most critical of our own work, and we get fussy over it.
And so this, about how long did it take?
This one took a couple of months to do, and it's twice this size because we have him folded under here, and he's huge. The whole piece is about 7 feet tall.
And where did you find this photo of him?
I found him in the local, well, there was a picture of him in the museum in my town, and I chased the original photo back to the Carnegie Museum in Boulder. And I went to them, they pulled it out of the archive. I told them what I wanted to do and got permission. And a lot of times I work from photos, and if they're not my photos, I'm very big on getting permission to use them, not stepping on someone's copyrights. And I think
well, especially if
really
you want to show
important.
them, you know, that's sort of a requirement. So. Well, he's amazing. As I said, I think before we started, it looks like young Ed Harris. I want somebody to write a movie and cast Ed Harris in it because I would like to see that movie.
So another one I did after that, and I dealt with the problem of the fuzzy edges. This is my stepson Daniel, who is a big runner, and I wanted to do this quilt depicting him, and it's again the fused raw edge applique, but this time I covered it with the very thin bridal veil tool, and it's enough to hold the edges down so they don't get fuzzy, and then I just do a lot of stitching over them. This particular piece has wording on it, and it's called Running Commentary. What I did was talk to Daniel about what goes through his mind when he's in a race, and we're all big runners in the family, so I run, his father runs, but I took those words and those thoughts, printed them on organza, and then I cut them out and then attached those strips over the fabric. So if you get up close, you can read it and you can see the things that are going through his mind. And there's little things in the background like step, step, step. And this is my race. I'm in control. I feel strong. I believe I can win. And he and I talked about really a running race is as much a mind game as it is a physical exercise. So,
and one other design, let's just show how you take it off
the edge.
Off the edge, and you were saying that's something you've been incorporating more.
I'm trying to incorporate this in all my quilts now. It's kind of my thing, and a way that you can go, oh, that's a Lee McComas quilt.
Well, it's one of your things because you definitely have a look, you know, and Zeke is kind of emblematic of that to me. But let's talk about this technique because this is taking it even a little bit further.
It is. This was the next step. And one of my frustrations was when you're only using fabric, you get this very cartoonish, blocky look to it. And I wanted to smooth that out and give it a more realistic look to it. So I started stitching over the faces. So these faces were done exactly like Zeke and exactly like Daniel, layers of fabric. But then I went over them with thread and tried to blend those boundaries between the different layers.
And you
of
do
fabric.
that on your long arm?
I do.
Okay.
When I started working this big, I did a couple of pieces on my domestic machine early on, and then I got a long arm, and it allows me to do these much larger pieces.
Sure. So just blending it even more. And this is one of your own photos, right?
Yes.
From
this was
Turkey.
A photo I took in eastern Turkey. I went with some friends. Our mission was to find Mount Ararat and Noah's Ark. So,
cool.
and in the process, we came across a Turkmen tribe camped on a hillside, and we spent the day with them. They fed us, and we talked. Well, we didn't talk with them because they couldn't speak English, and my Turkish I knew a little bit of, but they spoke a different dialect.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And then let's finish up with this guy here. So this is one that was at Houston.
Yes.
Right, in 2014. That
2014.
Came home with an award.
It did. This won first place in the pictorial portrait quilt category. And so it's called Panning for Gold. This is another historical photo. I got this one from the History Colorado Center down in Denver, and I've gotten several from them. I'm working on a whole series now. I'm really drawn to just that life in this region, you know, 100, 200 years ago. So I'm doing a whole series of them. Again, he goes off the edge, and I'm doing the thread painting. Yeah, yeah. And people kind of like that. There's something about that that really makes these characters pop off the background, is having them go off the edge. I did have a couple of problems with this one, a couple of funny stories with it. I finished this one on the long arm, I took it off, I hung it up on the design wall and stood back to look at it, and I saw two problems going on. And one was the temperature. So I was learning about that, how warm colors come forward and cool colors go backward. So I stitched this hand in very warm reds, orangish reds, and this hand back here in some grayish reds, to try and create that depth, that visual depth. But when I stood back and looked at it, I had taken it too far. This hand came forward, and this hand just looked necrotic. It looked like it was dead, and it would fall off. So I had to put it back on the long arm and then blend the threads together. So some of these warmer threads got blended into this hand, and some of these grayer threads got blended in this front hand to try and bring them back together.
That value and that color is so integral to the type of work that you do.
Yes.
And that's actually part of what's in your book.
Yeah.
And that's also part of what we're discussing in the other episode that we're doing with you, correct? About value and whatnot.
Yes. So. And how you can use that to create the depth, because you really need, you have to work those issues, otherwise it's just a flat quilt.
And as you just described, you definitely had to work those issues with this quilt.
And the other issue I had was when I took this off, I looked at it and I realized he had 5 fingers right here, not with a thumb. And so I was horrified. And I debated, because there's a lot of work to redo that. And my husband said, oh, call him 6-Finger Willie and just move on. And I thought about it, but in the end I had to put this back on, and then I had to redo the stitching here to redistribute the fingers. Yeah,
that's really funny. Well, you know, these are the little stories behind the top winners.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing these quilts and your stories with us. Sure. Be sure to come back and join us for our next episode with Lee, where she's going to talk about her use of color and value. And we hope that you will join us then. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye. Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.